Everything changed the day my brother-in-law decided to meet my wife for lunch. At first, it seemed harmless. Family members in our circle often grab quick meals or share coffee. But this time, something about the invitation felt off. Perhaps it was the tone of his voice, or the uneasy way he asked for her time, insisting it was important. My wife mentioned it to me before she left that morning, sounding puzzled but not alarmed. I remember telling her, "Go find out what he wants. It's probably nothing serious." Little did I know that lunch would expose the disturbing undercurrent threatening to tear our family apart. But this wouldn't be the only revelation that left us reeling. Before we could catch our breath, a chain of events would unravel, revealing secrets none of us could have imagined. And once the truth started pouring out, there was no stopping the tidal wave of consequences. My wife arrived at a bustling cafe near her workplace. The lunch crowd's chatter and clinking plates offered a sense of normalcy, which helped to ease her nerves. She took a seat by the window, her eyes scanning the entrance for my brother-in-law. He appeared a few minutes later, looking strangely nervous, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, eyes darting around the room. My wife greeted him warmly, though she felt a subtle chill run down her spine at the sight of his uneasy grin. If only she had known how drastic this conversation would be, she might have walked out before the first words were even spoken. But she stayed, unaware that the next moments would shift the entire axis of our family's tight bonds. No sooner had they settled at the table and ordered their meals than he began. Without any preamble, he told her she looked beautiful, that she always did. She was polite, assuming he was being sweet. But it didn't stop there. With a trembling voice, he poured out feelings he claimed to have bottled up for years. He said she had always been the one for him, that from the moment they met he had felt a deep connection. He declared he wanted a life with her, describing in lurid detail how different everything would be if she were by his side. Imagine sitting across from a man you've always trusted, someone married to your own sister, only to hear him speak about grand, passionate love as if it were the most normal thing in the world. That's exactly where my wife found herself, and it was the start of our family's darkest chapter. She tried interrupting him, telling him this was madness, but he pushed on, practically pleading with her to feel the same way. My wife, stunned into silence, finally leapt up from her seat, her chair scraping the floor with a jarring screech. She couldn't stand to hear one more word. As she stumbled out of the cafe, her phone buzzed. He was already calling, sending frantic apologies, trying to backtrack. The damage, however, was done. Little did we know that these calls and messages were only the prelude. Far darker confessions and revelations lay ahead, and every new piece of information would feel like a fresh betrayal. She reached me on the phone, voice shaking, words tumbling out in breathless shock. I remember pacing around our living room, feeling my heart thump an erratic beat as I listened to her recount the entire exchange. The more she spoke, the more disbelief sank its claws into me. This was the same brother-in-law who joked around at every family barbecue, who was the fun uncle to our kids who had once seemed so harmless. Now he was professing love to my wife and conjuring illusions of a life together. But it wasn't just that he had crossed a line. The scariest part was that in his mind, this made perfect sense. He sounded convinced that she might actually welcome his confession. That eerie conviction, in the face of obvious reality, would become a recurring theme as the family storm unfolded. When my wife hurried home early from work, we sat down together, her phone buzzing nonstop. The brother-in-law wouldn't let up, calling, texting, begging for her not to tell my sister. I told her to pick up and put him on speaker so I could hear every word. The moment he realized I was listening, he launched into a flurry of apologies directed at both of us. He claimed he had misread signals, that he honestly believed my wife felt the same. Supposedly, some fleeting moments at the last family gathering had confirmed his delusion. Yet beneath his begging, there was something else. An undercurrent of panic at the thought of his secret coming out. It hinted at deeper layers of deception that soon would break our world wide open. He pleaded with us not to tell my sister, saying he'd do anything, even swearing he had never cheated on her, that this was the only time he'd ever harbored such feelings. He kept insisting, "Swear on my children's lives. It's only your wife. It's always been her." That phrase stuck with me like a thorn. It was as if he believed that declaring his obsession to be singular would somehow lessen the betrayal. But the betrayal was total. Whether it was only my wife or every woman he'd ever laid eyes on, the damage to my trust, and soon, to the entire family's sense of unity, was absolute. And we were about to find out that this had just begun. We faced an agonizing choice. Should we keep this quiet until we could speak to my sister in a measured way, or rush over and reveal everything that very same night? My wife wanted to tell her right away, convinced this secret was too big to hide for even 1 hour. But I balked, thinking about how my sister would feel, about my nieces whose world would be shattered. In the end, we waited, though it was a restless, painful wait. Sometimes, waiting only gives the deceiver a chance to strike first. That's precisely what happened next, and it shook us to our core when my sister called in tears, repeating a twisted version of the story we knew so well. A little after midnight, my phone blared. On the other end, my sister sounded both furious and desperate. She told me that her husband had come to her in hysterics, claiming my wife was the one who tried to start an affair with him. He'd flipped the truth, painting her as the aggressor. My sister was heartbroken and confused, uncertain of who to believe, so she called me for answers. That moment felt like the ground was crumbling beneath my feet. My worst fear that our delay would allow him to twist the story had come true. Now I had to set the record straight before more damage was done. I wasted no time. I told my sister it was a lie, every last word of his accusation. Then I hung up and called our parents, explaining the situation in a furious tumble of words. They insisted on meeting at my sister's place immediately, volunteering to watch my nieces so we could confront the brother-in-law. Next, I called my younger brother, who promised to head over to our house and look after our own kids. Everyone was mobilizing in the middle of the night, bracing for a confrontation none of us had ever expected to face. But in moments like these, family loyalty can be a double-edged sword. While we all banded together to support my sister, the tension threatened to explode into a level of conflict that would leave scars for years to come. We arrived at my sister's home under a tense moonlight. She stood on the porch, arms folded, tears glistening on her cheeks, while her husband hovered by her side. I could barely look at him, my anger a swirling storm in my gut. My wife stepped up beside my sister, handing her the phone with the text messages and voicemails that proved the truth. With each scroll, my sister's eyes darkened further. She listened to his voice, the unambiguous confessions, and the frantic apologies. By the time she set the phone down, something had shifted in her gaze, a resolve that left no room for doubt. Yet the brother-in-law, a firefighter by trade and usually so confident, was reduced to sobbing. For a brief moment, the man who ran into burning buildings now stood hopeless and broken in the face of his own self-created inferno. And we all braced ourselves for the flames. The confrontation that followed was as raw as it gets. He tried to plead, tried to offer excuses, but my sister dismissed him with an authority I'd never seen from her before. "Pack a bag and go," she said, her voice low and unwavering. Once he had retreated inside to follow her command, she turned and wrapped her arms around my wife. It was a gesture of unity, one that said, "I believe you, and I stand by you." The relief that washed over my wife was palpable, but this was far from the end. Betrayals that run this deep rarely resolve with a single bag packed and a few apologetic tears. In fact, we were about to see just how complicated and unnerving this situation really was. After the brother-in-law left, my sister began asking question after question, trying to piece together any tiny detail that might have given him hope of my wife's mutual interest. My wife explained her naturally playful personality, her jokes, the friendly banter that she shared not just with him, but with everyone in the family, my mom, my younger brother, even old friends from college. We combed through her texts to him, searching for any sign of flirting or coded language that might have sparked his delusion. There was nothing. Every message was ordinary, covering kids' schedules, upcoming holidays, and the usual mundane chatter of family life. But a single moment, a seemingly benign interaction, can sometimes plant the seed of obsession. As we discovered, that's exactly what happened when my wife and brother-in-law reached for the fridge at the same time one weekend. My wife recalled how they had playfully bumped into each other in our kitchen, each racing to grab something. He let her win, stepping aside with a mischievous grin. Then he leaned around her waist to get a beer, his arm brushing along her torso in a way that felt a tad too intimate. She had shrugged it off in the moment, never imagining it could be interpreted as an invitation. We realize now that even this small incident might have encouraged his fantasy. But that was only the tip of the iceberg. The real gut punch came when my sister delved into his computer files, searching for anything else he might be hiding, and what she found left us speechless. In a folder buried under layers of subfolders, she stumbled across a shocking stash of photos, images of my wife taken over several years. Some were from a Caribbean trip we took as couples, images of her relaxing in a bikini, completely unaware that someone was snapping covert pictures. Others showed her at family gatherings, singled out in the frame. Each photo was strictly of her, cut out from any larger group context. It was chilling. We had known the brother-in. Law's confession was disturbing, but these photos represented an entirely different level of obsession. This was no spur-of-the-moment mistake. This was years of meticulous fixation. My sister's anger was now laced with horror. She called us to her side, voice shaking as she showed us the hidden images. One after another, they painted a story of a man lurking in plain sight, capturing private moments without the subject's knowledge or consent. My wife's face was drawn and pale. She stood there trembling, the full weight of his fixation making her stomach churn. Creeping dread replaced the initial shock. What else had he done in secret? Where else were lines crossed? It felt like we had only uncovered the beginning of something far more sinister. We all began to wonder if this behavior could cross into legal territory, possibly a restraining order. My sister was furious and terrified at the same time, and she refused to let this go unchecked. With a fierce resolve, she decided to speak to a lawyer. This was no longer just a matter of moral betrayal. It was potentially a matter of safety. If he was capable of photographing my wife surreptitiously, who knew what else he might do? Yet, even as we tried to grapple with the question of how far his obsessions extended, there was another piece of the puzzle waiting to be revealed. And when it surfaced, it would add a disturbing layer to the story. That new bombshell arrived later when my sister confronted her husband and insisted on having my wife present via FaceTime. She wanted no more lies, no half-truths, so she recorded the conversation. The brother-in-law, looking utterly defeated, began to speak in a near monotone. He admitted his obsession was not some passing fancy that emerged last week or even last year. He'd been fixated on my wife from practically the day they met. He started from the very beginning, describing how something about her lit up his world from the moment he laid eyes on her. His every sentence dripped with a twisted sense of admiration. And with each word he spoke, the pit in our stomachs grew heavier. He mentioned the barbecues, the family dinners, the birthdays, describing how he found subtle ways to be near her, helping set the table, offering to drive her home if she needed a ride, or volunteering to arrange group outings. All those times when we thought he was just being a helpful member of the family, he was crafting opportunities to feed his obsession. As he confessed, it became starkly clear that none of us had seen the danger signs. He'd concealed it behind a mask of friendliness for years, biding his time and letting his fixation intensify. And now that mask was shattered. My sister stayed silent while he spoke, her lips pressed in a thin line. Only when he started suggesting that my wife had given him signals did her composure crack. She erupted, calling him out for deluding himself into believing his fantasies. My wife, overwhelmed, joined in, cussing him out in a mix of fury and disgust. The entire call was recorded, every trembling word of his confession, every outraged shout from my wife and sister. Finally, my wife had enough and ended the call, her hand shaking as she set down her phone. In the aftermath of that conversation, the question wasn't just how he had fallen this far. It was whether we had all missed signs that he was capable of crossing even more dangerous boundaries. That night, I tried to comfort my wife, reminding her that none of this was her fault. She was still reeling from the discovery that someone she trusted so closely had been secretly pining for her. She repeated what she'd said from the start, that it was impossible for her to ever see him in that light. Early in our relationship, she had made it clear to me that trust was paramount. She didn't do half measures when it came to commitment, and if she ever felt betrayed or considered stepping out, she'd walk away before humiliating someone in that manner. Now, that same unbreakable sense of loyalty and honesty she'd always had was being tested by the twisted illusions of a man who refused to respect family boundaries. We wondered how we'd ever feel safe at family gatherings again. My sister, fiercely protective of her kids, had bigger decisions to make. She needed to ensure that her children weren't subjected to a toxic environment. She immediately contacted a lawyer who advised her on how to document everything: the texts, the voicemails, the images. Each piece of evidence strengthened her case for seeking full custody, should she choose to pursue it. And the brother-in-law? He seemed to be sinking deeper into a pit of regret and humiliation, but regret alone wouldn't erase the damage he'd done or the madness that still flickered in his eyes. Even though my sister told him to pack his bags, legally, she couldn't force him out just yet. He returned home, half defeated, half clinging to some desperate hope. She made it crystal clear that their relationship was beyond saving, and he would eventually have to leave. But for now, they existed in an uncomfortable stalemate under the same roof. The tension in that house was so thick, it was almost tangible. She moved around with calm determination, focusing solely on her children, who were thankfully asleep during most of the shouting matches. But how do you navigate day-to-day life when your partner has revealed a disturbing obsession with your own sibling's spouse? There was no easy answer, only the certainty that the path forward would be painful for everyone. As the days inched forward, more unsettling layers emerged. Friends started asking pointed questions, noticing the tension in our extended family. My sister kept her circle small, discussing the situation only with trusted confidants. Rumors still circulated, especially since the brother-in-law had made attempts to twist the narrative. Each time we saw a missed call or an unexpected text, we braced ourselves for more lies. Then came another chilling development: an email from the brother-in-law to my wife. He'd created a brand new account just to contact her. Despite her blocking him on every platform, he found a way to make his words reach her again. In that long, rambling email, he started by apologizing profusely, saying he'd never gotten to finish his heartfelt confession at the restaurant. But as he continued, the real purpose of the email became scarily clear. He poured out his obsession once more, describing every reason he adored her, from her laughter to the tone of her voice. He insisted they shared an intense, undeniable chemistry, that somehow they were both burning with the same fire. His delusion was unwavering, nearly impossible to reason with. This time, however, he took a nasty turn in the final paragraphs, directing a barrage of insults toward me. It was as though he believed if he painted me as incompetent or undeserving, my wife would see his side more clearly. But all he did was expose the depth of his resentment and his willingness to attack me to get to her. Reading that email made my blood boil. I could see the heartbreak in my wife's eyes as she scanned his words. Instead of feeling flattered, she was horrified. She forwarded it to my sister, who promptly sent it to her lawyer. If there was ever any doubt about the seriousness of his obsessive behavior, that email obliterated it. With each unhinged paragraph, the question loomed larger. Could this man become dangerous? Was it only a matter of time before his frantic obsession escalated beyond words? My sister's lawyer advised that the email, along with the photos and recorded confessions, could be grounds for a protective order. They discussed strategies for accelerating custody proceedings, ensuring that he'd have minimal contact with the children if necessary. My sister, no longer shaken by heartbreak, was now fueled by protective rage and unwavering certainty that this marriage was beyond salvage. But divorces aren't final overnight, and while she navigated the legal system, we all tried to maintain a veneer of normalcy for the kids. Yet we knew their world was changing forever, and there was no turning back. In quieter moments, my wife wrestled with guilt. She kept replaying friendly banter and family get-togethers, asking if she had been too nice or too relaxed around him. I assured her repeatedly that she had done nothing wrong. Trusting someone in your own family circle isn't a mistake. It's natural. But when someone else twists that trust into a personal fantasy, it's on them, not on the person who is simply being friendly. Still, guilt can linger long after logic tells you you're innocent. And as we discovered, emotional wounds leave scars that reason alone can't heal. Meanwhile, the brother-in-law sulked around my sister's house in a defeated haze. He stopped trying to explain himself, at least verbally, but occasionally he'd leave notes or letters, each more desperate than the last. In them, he alternated between claiming he was mentally unstable, asking for help, or insisting that he and my wife shared some fated connection. My sister turned those letters over to her lawyer, too, building an airtight case for when the custody hearing approached. But a question gnawed at all of us. Was it truly a one-time fixation? Or could he have been obsessed with others too? Had we only uncovered the tip of the iceberg? Some friends suggested we investigate further, concerned that someone capable of such obsession might have targeted more than one woman. Yet, every clue we had pointed back to a singular fixation on my wife. It was beyond mere infatuation. It was an all-consuming fascination that had taken root in his psyche for years. For now, we focused on the evidence before us, the existing threat that overshadowed the entire family. Every day seemed to bring a new piece of the puzzle, each revealing how deep his illusions went. But the biggest question remained: how would we ever fully mend the fractured relationships he left in his wake? At work, I found myself distracted, going through the motions while my mind replayed the drama at home. Colleagues noticed a change in my mood, but I couldn't bring myself to share the humiliating truth. My wife also struggled to stay focused. She'd glance at her phone nervously, worried he'd find another method to contact her. We tried to reassure each other that we were taking the right steps, involving lawyers and documenting everything. Yet anxiety lingered like a constant buzz in the back of our mind. Fear is a strange emotion. It lingers even after you lock your doors and close your windows. And though we didn't believe he would physically harm her, we couldn't shake the possibility that desperation might tip him over the edge. My sister, on the other hand, was forging ahead with unexpected resilience. She balanced her job, the kids, and appointments with the lawyer as if she'd been preparing for this crisis her entire life. Her heartbreak was evident, but she channeled it into determination, focusing on her children's well-being above all else. She scheduled sessions with a child psychologist, bracing for the day she'd have to explain why their father wouldn't be living with them anymore. It is never easy telling kids why their secure world is about to be split in two, and in this situation, the truth was particularly horrifying to share. But my sister's steely resolve would guide them through it, no matter how painful it was. Our parents helped however they could, cooking meals, babysitting, offering moral support. Their faces carried the weight of disappointment and sorrow. They liked him, trusted him, and even bragged to neighbors about the hero firefighter in the family. Now, they were grappling with how they'd been so blind to his unhealthy obsession. When our parents confronted him directly, their heartbreak turned to anger, and anger to bitter silence. They realized that once a man reveals such a capacity for deceit, there's no easy path to acceptance or forgiveness. Surprisingly, the brother-in-law didn't argue. In fact, he stopped defending himself altogether. It was as though he'd come to see that he had destroyed the illusions he built and left scorched earth behind him. In those days, the house he once called home felt more like a battleground. With him as a reluctant occupant, my sister barely spoke to him, only addressing matters related to the kids. Once in a while, I'd get a text from him too, short messages that read like attempts at self-pity, but I had long since lost interest in hearing his excuses. Not all heartbreak is created equal. Some heartbreaks sever the last cord of empathy you have for someone. For me, and for the rest of the family, that cord was irreparably cut. A week later, a temporary custody hearing took place. My sister presented the texts, the voicemails, screenshots of the photos from his laptop, and transcripts of the calls he'd made to my wife. All of it formed a compelling argument that he was not stable enough to be around the children unsupervised. While he didn't contest her request for full custody, the court scheduled a follow-up to finalize everything. In the meantime, he was granted limited visitation, supervised by a court-appointed official if necessary. The look on his face when the judge delivered this verdict was one of utter defeat. But was he truly defeated? Or was he quietly nursing the same obsession, waiting for an opportunity to fan the flames again? We could only hope that the legal system's watchful eye would deter him from further madness. Life went on in a surreal fashion. My sister prepared her kids for the changes ahead, carefully selecting words that shielded them from the ugliest parts of the truth. She told them Dad would be living elsewhere, that they'd still see him, but things were going to be different. The older child, perceptive and sensitive, asked more probing questions, but my sister stood firm in giving only gentle, vague replies. She knew that one day they might learn the real story, and that day would bring a storm of emotions beyond anything they could handle in their childhood years. Back at our own house, my wife and I tried to reclaim some normalcy. We avoided large gatherings or extended family dinners, partly out of caution and partly because we couldn't bear the tension. My wife put extra effort into her work, diving into projects to distract her from the swirling chaos. Yet at night, I'd catch her staring off, her eyes clouded with worry or guilt, convinced she had somehow contributed to his deranged fantasy by simply being too nice. I would gently remind her that kindness is not a sin. You don't deserve punishment for being warm-hearted. But that unwavering sense of guilt had found fertile ground in her shaken psyche, and it refused to let go easily. During one of our calmer evenings, we spoke about the future, how we'd handle birthdays and holidays once the divorce was settled. Could we ever all be in the same place again without dredging up the trauma? We doubted it. The simplest gatherings would be overshadowed by this giant rift. Even if the brother-in-law was absent, the ghost of his actions would hang over the table, reminding everyone that we'd once believed we were safe in each other's company. Yet, ironically, the very closeness of our family was what gave him so many opportunities. Our collective trust gave him endless access to moments alone with my wife, to private jokes, to inside references. In a twisted way, the downfall of that trust was the catalyst for his entire delusion. More days passed. The brother-in-law began moving some of his belongings into storage. Occasionally, he'd attempt to speak to my sister, likely hoping for a sliver of forgiveness, but she kept her distance. Their few conversations were stilted and formal, like two strangers forced to discuss the most basic tasks. Meanwhile, my sister got updates from her lawyer, who was preparing the final steps for the divorce. It wasn't a matter of if, but when, they'd legally sever ties. Yet some divorces can drag on forever, burdened by legal wrangling and emotional baggage. We had to steel ourselves for the possibility that he'd find new ways to complicate the process or manipulate the system. One evening, a relative from out of state called me. She'd caught wind of a rumor that my brother-in-law was actually framed by my wife. Of all people, pure nonsense he must have spread in desperation. According to this rumor, my wife had enticed him, hoping to break up his marriage for some twisted vendetta. My fury rose to new heights, but I calmly set the record straight, explaining we had proof of everything. Our relative listened with shock, and by the end, she apologized on his behalf, saying she never believed him but had to ask to be sure. It served as a grim reminder that lies travel quickly, and in the vacuum of truth, people will cling to whatever story they hear first. The longer we took to speak out, the more space his version had to spread. Despite that, we pressed on, never missing a chance to clarify the truth. We shared the evidence with those who mattered, ensuring nobody in the family was left doubting my wife's integrity. Gradually, the rumor mill lost steam as more relatives understood the brother-in-law's deception. He lost whatever sympathy he might have garnered, and his isolation became more complete. But isolation can be dangerous for someone whose mind is already teetering. Each day, we worried about what he might do next. Was he truly repentant, or just biding his time to lash out again? In the midst of all this, my wife tried to focus on healing. She began seeing a therapist, realizing she needed help processing the betrayal of a man she once considered family. The therapist helped her understand that she was a victim of someone else's twisted infatuation, and that blaming herself was counterproductive. Slowly, day by day, she found healthier ways to cope. She started journaling, pouring her anger and disbelief onto paper. Sometimes she'd share excerpts with me, and I could see the burden lifting from her, even if just a bit. Recovery from a betrayal this deep is never linear. Some days you think you've moved forward, only to be slammed back by a new memory or a fresh piece of evidence. And in that roller coaster of emotions, the only constant is uncertainty. My sister's children began noticing the change at home, especially as their father's presence became sporadic. His supervised visits felt forced, lacking the warmth a child expects from a parent. They saw the tension, heard the muffled arguments. Kids are perceptive, after all. My sister asked the child psychologist for guidance, and together, they devised age-appropriate explanations that didn't demonize the father outright, but also didn't lie about the separation. But even the gentlest explanation can't mask the pain when a child realizes their father no longer sleeps under the same roof. And as the children's questions grew more insistent, the damage inflicted by his obsession echoed louder. Back on our side, my wife and I considered legal measures for our own safety. A restraining order might be the next step if he continued to harass her. We had the email, the texts, the recorded phone calls. My wife felt a mix of dread and sadness. "I can't believe it's come to this," she'd say, pressing her palm to her forehead. The reality that a family member could become a stalker-like presence felt surreal, as though we'd stepped into a story we'd once have dismissed as sensationalized fiction. In many ways, that's exactly what we were living. A nightmare scenario that most people watch in dramatic thrillers, never expecting it to unfold in their own living room. And yet, here we were, bracing ourselves for whatever move he'd make next. Time crawled forward. The official hearing date for the divorce was set, and the countdown began. My sister's lawyer was confident they'd be able to finalize it quickly, with my brother-in-law offering little resistance. He appeared resigned, almost lifeless, as though he'd lost the one thing driving him, his fantasy. Occasionally, he still tried to contact my wife, but each attempt only strengthened our resolve to see this through. Still, part of me wondered, would we ever truly be safe? Even if the law sided with us, could a piece of paper protect us from someone who'd shown such a deep disregard for moral and familial boundaries? Support from friends and extended family became our lifeline. They organized small gatherings without him, ensuring that my sister, my wife, and I felt safe. People chipped in for babysitting, meals, errands, trying to ease the burden of constant stress. It reminded me that in the worst storms, strong friendships and family ties can offer a beacon of hope, even if the storm itself can't be calmed immediately. But a new wave of complications arose when the brother-in-law's close friends started contacting us, some wanting to hear our side, others accusing us of lying. The swirling sea of opinions threatened to drag us into another round of drama. We held firm, sharing evidence selectively when needed, but refusing to be dragged into public mudslinging. The more we laid bare, the clearer it became to any skeptic that he'd been the instigator, collecting pictures and sending delusional messages. Eventually, those who truly valued the truth stood down, while his staunch defenders grew quieter, unable to refute the mountain of proof. In a story like this, neutrality isn't an option. People either accept the facts or live in denial. And each new piece of evidence pushed more people out of the denial camp. Finally, the day of the divorce hearing arrived. My sister walked into the courtroom in a crisp outfit, shoulders back, head high. Her lawyer marched beside her, a folder overflowing with meticulously organized documents. My brother-in-law sat across the aisle, looking gaunt and hollowed out, as though he were physically carrying the weight of his own obsession on his back. The tension in that room could have been cut with a knife. Proceedings like these often don't last long when one side offers little resistance, but the emotional toll is massive. Each formal word from the judge echoed in our ears, signaling the dismantling of a marriage that had started with love and promise. My sister testified briefly, explaining the betrayal and the reasons she needed full custody. The lawyer presented the evidence of his unhealthy fixation, making it clear that this was not a simple marital dispute, but a disturbing pattern that put both her and the children at risk. My brother-in-law mumbled in agreement at certain points, never outright denying the allegations. The final decree granted my sister the divorce and full legal custody, with strictly supervised visitation for him. It was official. The marriage was dissolved, and yet the shadow of his obsession didn't vanish with the slam of a judge's gavel. We still had to face the day-to-day reality of healing old wounds and maintaining vigilance. My wife and I exhaled a collective sigh of relief, but it was tinged with sadness for my sister, who had genuinely loved this man at one point. She confided that the man she'd divorced felt like a stranger compared to the one she originally married. In some ways, it was like discovering she'd never truly known him. The heartbreak mingled with anger, forging a new sense of purpose in her life, to rebuild for herself and her kids a home free from secrets and lies. Yet, in the back of our minds, a small voice asked, could he let go of his obsession and move on, or would he keep trying to disrupt our lives? We had to be ready for any outcome. Weeks passed, and the brother-in-law, now ex-brother-in-law, moved out completely. He rented a small apartment and settled into what seemed like a quiet routine. My sister changed the locks and felt a wave of relief wash over her. The children began therapy sessions, expressing confusion and sorrow, but also showing remarkable resilience, a testimony to how strong they could be under their mother's unwavering care. From the outside, one might think the worst was over. But when emotional trauma slices into a family, the repercussions can echo for years, sometimes decades. And we were just starting to see the shape of that aftermath. All contact now happened through lawyers or court-appointed channels. My wife had blocked him on every conceivable platform, and any attempt to circumvent that barrier was reported back to my sister's lawyer. Surprisingly, his outreach attempts dwindled, as though he realized he had no audience left for his pleas. The hush that followed was eerie, like the quiet after a violent storm, where the world feels unnaturally still. We wondered if he had finally snapped back to reality, or if this was just another phase of an obsession that could flare up again at any moment. The uncertainty lurked in our minds, a silent reminder that not every storm ends with sunshine. During this period, my wife found solace in talking to my sister often. They grew even closer, supporting each other through the daily pangs of anxiety and reflection. My sister confessed that she felt numb sometimes, as if the heartbreak was too enormous to process all at once. My wife, still wrestling with guilt, tried to console her, reminding her that none of this was her fault, that the only person to blame was the ex-brother-in-law, who had cultivated a secret life right under everyone's noses. Strength can emerge from the bleakest circumstances, and in that darkness, the bond between my wife and my sister became unbreakable. But the same darkness also lingered, threatening to overshadow any sense of final closure. Eventually, as the months rolled on, we all started to find new rhythms. My sister busied herself with her children's activities, soccer practices, piano lessons, school events, making sure their lives were filled with as much normalcy as possible. My wife and I took a step back from big family functions, still uneasy about the inevitable questions. People gossiped less once the divorce was old news, and new tidbits of neighborhood drama replaced our family scandal. The world, as always, moved on. But the shadows of the past have a way of creeping up on you in unguarded moments. And though the immediate crisis was over, we knew that healing from betrayal this personal is a marathon, not a sprint. That healing process has been slow but steady. My wife's therapy sessions helped her rebuild confidence, releasing the guilt that plagued her. My sister switched her focus to building a strong single-parent household, trusting that she could offer a stable life for the kids. I tried to be there for everyone, ensuring no one carried the burden alone. Yet there is always that nagging question at the edges of our minds. How do you trust again after discovering that deception can fester so easily within your own family? We were learning to take it one day at a time. In the end, the brother-in-law's obsession was like a dark undercurrent that had been quietly tugging at the foundation of our family for years. None of us sensed it until it came crashing to the surface. And when it did, it left cracks in relationships that might never fully mend. The memory of him professing love for my wife, the photos hidden away in his laptop, the desperate emails and texts, those can't simply be erased from our minds. Still, as difficult as the journey has been, it also taught us an invaluable lesson about boundaries, vigilance, and the reality that sometimes people closest to you harbor shocking secrets. For now, life has reached a new normal. My sister is finalizing the details of her new life, raising her kids with a sense of fortitude she never knew she had. My wife and I continue to stand side by side, our bond tested but not broken. We have taken steps to ensure no contact with him, and so far, he hasn't attempted further intrusion into our lives. I sometimes reflect on how we got here, just an invitation to lunch, a seemingly trivial event that detonated a hidden bomb within our family. It proved that no matter how close you think you are, no one is immune to betrayal or obsession. Yet, as unsettling as this chapter has been, it serves as a reminder that illusions can shatter in an instant. And once they do, the only way forward is to face the pieces head-on, determined to build something stronger from the wreckage. That is exactly what we are doing, piecing our lives back together and forging a future where this betrayal doesn't define us, but rather reminds us to treasure the family and friends who remain true. We may be scarred, but we are also wiser, more vigilant, and deeply protective of those we love. Our shared hope is that, with time, the pain of this experience will lessen, leaving us not with bitterness, but with a hardened resolve never to let such a deception take root again.